I don't need to talk very loud now. Okay. So I want to thank my collaborators, Dr. Scott McWilliams, who's a colleague of mine at the University of Rhode Island, and then Doug Krause. I'm just curious, how many people here knew Doug Krause? So there's some people that knew Doug well. So Doug unfortunately passed away in 2000, but this talk and all the work is due to the dedication of Doug, and I'll talk about that in a second. So I don't know how many of you have seen these slides talking about Ken Rose, the paper that came out in 2019, talking about the decline of birds. Maybe you haven't seen this particular slide from their paper showing different species that have groups of birds that have declined. So you can see the various taxa, so anything in red just showing the rate of decline. So actually one thing that nobody points out is the one group of birds that decline more than anything is house sparrows in North America. A little bit surprising. But there's a lot of species that maybe we would prefer to see not declining that are shown here. So sparrows, wood warblers, blackbirds, et cetera. Whereas the groups of birds that are increasing include turkeys and grouse, gnatcatchers, ducks and geese, and somewhat surprisingly, vireos as well too. So this is the picture, and remember that all this is based on work from 1970 to about 2001. But Doug Krause started the bird banding station at Kingston he initially started to band birds there in 1956. And he really started to do it in earnest in 1960. Now the shocking thing to me is that, if you know that, those of you who know him, he was a chemistry professor at URI. And every fall, he banded birds in his yard. And I don't know, as I teach at URI, I don't know how he taught chemistry classes and still managed to band birds most days as well too, but he did it. And he kept really detailed notes. He was a product of the Depression, and so a lot of his original field notes were written in his notebooks from when he was in 4th grade. So we didn't want to throw anything away, so we'd just write in the back of all these old notebooks. Luckily, we kept these really detailed records, and so thanks to his work, we can talk about bird population trends. So the Kingston banding station, here's the University of Rhode Island, here's 138, his property is here. It's 82 acres. He bought it in 1955 for $5,000. So, as I mentioned, he maintained a steady bird banding operation there. So there's a series of mist nets, and I think a lot of you are aware of what mist nets are like, and they're designed to catch birds. And this is the current configuration of where the mist nets that we were monitoring. So Doug, he typically had 4 mist nets operating. So from 1960 to 1994, every fall, he would have these nets open. And then it started he left an endowment. And he donated his property to Audubon Society of Rhode Island. And he also left an endowment to maintain this long-term bird banding operation. So starting in 1998 to the present, starting on the 7th of August through the 31st of October, 5 hours per day, starting before dawn, we operate these nets. And so he operated 4. We increased the number of nets to 10, so there's a slight increase in the effort. So if you look at, this just gives some idea of the effort. So each hour a mist net is open is referred to as a net hour. And we standardize the metrics by how many birds captured per 100 net hours. So you can see that he averaged about a little bit under 600 net hours annually from 1960 to 1998. And then we started it here, and the amount of effort varies year to year based on weather conditions and everything. We try to have the nets open every single day, 7 days a week. But if it's rainy out, we shut down the nets. We don't want to hurt the birds. So again, we're averaging about 3,600 net hours per year annually when you or I took over the banding operations. But since everything's standardized by net hours, we can still look at an index to capture rates. Just looking at this a little bit more in detail, so the orange represents August, blue is September, and yellow is October. This shows the percent of days the nets were open. So we try to have them open 7 days a week. In poor weather conditions, which is much more likely in October, you can see that they're not as open as often. And then I think he must have had a heavy teaching schedule, particularly in the early years in October, and then he kind of increased his effort. So he's fairly out there very often to catch birds. So overall, so these data represent about 45,000 captures of individuals. Each bird is banded with the Fish and Wildlife Service band aged and sexed. So the most common species caught during this whole time period is yellow-rumped warbler, myrtle warbler subspecies, and gray catbird. So about 15% of all the captures, and then white-throated sparrows, common yellowthroat, and American redstart were the top 5 species that were captured at the banding station. So this is a birding audience, and so everybody's excited, well, what rare species did you detect there over the years? And I just give you some examples of them. So believe it or not, even though this is a fairly wooded area, in 1963 they caught a gray grasshopper sparrow there. It's not your typical marsh wren habitat, but there are 2 marsh wrens captured there. Prothonotary warbler was caught in 1966 and 2018 as well too. Kentucky warbler is another rare species, and then cerulean warbler too are just examples of some of the rare species that were caught at the station that everybody's jealous about to hear. So if you look at the trends in species captured, so this is just the number of species captured annually over time, you can see that the number of species captured over time has stayed relatively stable. There hasn't been that much difference in the average number of species that have been caught at the banding station. I don't know if that's surprising to you or not, but it's, just think about your time out going out birding and what you see. So you typically see the same number of species. I don't know what your eBird list look like over time, but hopefully over the number of species you're seeing annually stays somewhat constant. But, and if you look at this, if you do a breakdown by migration strategy, so those individuals that are year-round residents, black-capped chickadee, tufted titmouse, for example, the number of species that stayed constant. If you look at short-distance migrants, things like eastern towhee, something that goes to the southern United States, their numbers are relatively constant too in terms of the number of species, and also the long-distance migrants, those species that are going to the Caribbean, to South America, black-polled warblers, a lot of the wood warblers and thrushes, their numbers are staying in terms of just the species that are captured. That hasn't changed much over time. But what's changing is the number of individuals for these different migration strategies. So if you look at the number of residents, there's just overall, this is the number of birds captured per 100 net hours. You can see resident populations being a slight decline. Those short distance migrants has seen a steeper decline, and that's what's really dropping out are those species that are long distance migrants. So a lot of the warblers and thrushes are the ones that are really showing these steep levels of decline. So overall, if you take all the captures together and look at the rate of decline, We've gone from a little bit about 130 birds per 100 net hours when Doug started in 1960. We're down to about 25 birds per 100 net hours now. So there's been this incredibly steep decline in, so it represents about a 75% decline in numbers of individuals that we're seeing at Kingston. So a lot of you, I can tell, have been birding for a while, and just think of, you know, I haven't been in Rhode Island for very long. I've only been here since 1995. But when I talk to people, the people who've been here for a long time, and they say, oh, you should have been here 20 or 30 years ago when there was warblers all over the place. It was crazy. You go to Block Island, and the place would just be flooded in this sea of birds. They're not lying to us. The people you talk to, that's definitely there. And this is what this is documenting, is you should have been here then, because that's when all the birds were around. And this is what just is, unfortunately, this is what it's documenting. So let's look at some of this. I'm just going to tell some stories about some of the species. And so one of the most abundant species, anybody who's worked at a banding station, with gray catbirds, they get covered in purple hands because of what their diet is. And gray catbird is by far one of the most abundant species at the banding station in a place like Kingston. And so if you look at the rate of decline of catbirds, you can see it was about 35 birds per net hour when Doug started, and now we're down to less than 5 individuals per net hour. So that's, sorry, did it go back? So that's like an 89% decline in number of catbirds in our area. So that's a species that declined dramatically. So let's look at this in a little bit more depth about what might be where this decline is taking place. So we can go to the breeding bird survey and look at population trends for gray catbird. So those areas in red, these are data from 1966 to 2021. Those areas in red are showing declines, and those areas in blue are showing increases. So you can see that in southeastern Canada, in New England, our area, there hasn't really been a decline in the number of breeding birds detected. But in eastern Canada, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, there's been a dramatic decline, and also southeastern Canada as well, too. So remember, the Kingston banding station, we're monitoring fall migration. So this dramatic decline in catbirds is presumably due to this decline of catbirds in Canada and Vermont and New Hampshire and other areas. Yellow-rumped warbler is another species that a lot of people are concerned about these days. It's one of the most abundant species, particularly in October, when we get this huge pulse of myrtle warblers coming through coastal Rhode Island. And if you look at their population trends, it's gone from about 17 birds per net hour in 1960 down to less than 4 now. So again, another 70% decrease in the numbers of myrtle warblers. But if you look at the interesting thing is if you look at the trends in myrtle warblers based on the breeding bird survey, it shows a moderate increase in Canada in the Appalachians. So if you look at the trends for yellow-rumped warblers, myrtle warblers, you can see it increased in about 2000. There's been a relatively steep decline in number of myrtle warblers since 2000 in the Appalachian Mountains. And then eastern Canada, too, interestingly, they also showed this peak in 2000 and the steady decline since 2000. And the boreal forest in southeastern Canada showed this increase in around 2000 and a decline since then, and a little bit in eastern Canada, too. What's behind this decline is uncertain, but it's definitely showing this steady decline since 2000 in numbers of myrtle warblers in our region. And, you know, if you go out birding these days, Just think about the number of myrtle warblers you saw 10 years ago versus now. You don't see as many myrtle warblers around right now as you used to. And coastal Rhode Island is key stopover habitat for them, and it's concerning. Tufted titmouse is something that's a ubiquitous species that's incredibly abundant now. But that's an example of a southern species that's spread north. So if you look at the data for Kingston, it didn't even show up as a species until 1967. So a lot of you probably started birding in Rhode Island when there weren't even any tufted titmouse around. And they've slowly, become much more abundant here. So this just documents that increase. And then just you look at BBS trends for number of titmice, you can see they've been steadily increasing. And now they're common throughout the area. So long distance migrants, and this is one of the more spectacular species that we have breeding in the region. This is unfortunately a species that is showing a steep decline. This is Canada warbler. And if you look at Canada warbler numbers, it's declined dramatically. It's not a really common species at the Kingston banding station, but when Doug first started, he was averaging about 2 individuals per 100 net hours. And now it's an extremely rare species to even catch it at the Kingston station. So, and this mirrors the trends based on the breeding bird survey for New England. So you can see there's a 3% annual decline in number of Canada warblers in the region. It's declined dramatically throughout the region. So that's a hard species to get these days because they've become so rare. And then American redstart is an example of a species that likes early young forested habitat. And if you look at the trends for American redstart based on the breeding bird survey, you can see that in Maine, New Hampshire, and eastern Canada, their numbers have declined. And if you look at redstart numbers at the banding station too, there's been about an 82% decline. So some of this is due to habitat conversion as the forests have become more mature. At Kingston Station, it's not as much ideal habitat, but some of this is probably due to changes in populations north of us, so leading to declines of individuals. And then common yellowthroat, you can see that throughout eastern North America, based on BBS data, the numbers have declined dramatically throughout eastern North America. And if you look at the banding data, we documented about an 82% decline in common yellowthroats as well too. So it's not a pleasant story. It's not a pleasant story. So same thing for common yellowthroat. If you look at their population trends, been shown also documented the steady decline in New England. So what do we do? I mean, it's always this major dilemma. And if you go to 3billionbirds.org website, they come up with a lot of great ideas about conservation awareness. A lot of people are aware of this issue, and for you to make your friends and students and colleagues aware of these issues. So it's a lot of factors that are driving these declines. It's not just one factor, as you're all aware of. So pesticides and decline in insect populations is a huge driver for this. As Carl talked about this morning, using native plants is a critical thing. Keeping cats indoors cat mortality is a huge issue. Windows, if you have any windows in your house, there's lots of stickers you can put on your windows to keep birds from flying into the windows. I have a campaign right now, so I teach at the University of Rhode Island, and there's So architects, they drive me crazy, and they like these big glass buildings that look spectacular, but they're, as Carl just mentioned earlier today too, the window mortality is a huge issue, and they like to leave the lights on at night, so I've been fighting them to keep those lights off at night because it attracts birds and increases the mortality rate too. So making people aware of these issues and trying to fight these issues is a critical thing to do too. And then, yeah, so I'm going to end it there. I want to thank all the people that have been the banders there, and I don't have everybody listed here who's been banded at the Kingston since 1998 when you or I took it over, but I want to thank all of them. So thank you very much.